The last half hour of this part, I'm just going to introduce Ray, who first published Aickman's collected strange stories in 2 volumes in 1999, which was the start of the new wave of publication of Aickman's work. These volumes, I think, 750?
750 the first printing.
And then a reprint, and they vanished. They became almost unobtainable. So everybody got hold of them and hung on to them. And since 2010, Tartrus have been republishing the stories one by one. But I'm sure that I think many people will be really interested in the story of what it's been like publishing Aickman and what's happened along the way. The world of Aickman's books, really. So
I'll do what I can, and I've got to apologise, especially to Chris and to Monica, but to all of you, that at some point I wasn't reading my emails quite as closely as I should have done. I haven't actually prepared a talk. I was assuming I was going to go on a panel and I was going to pontificate with the best of them. I have half an hour now, and if I start mumbling and you can't hear me in the back, or rambling, someone hopefully will prod me. 1999, I was contacted by David Tibet, the musician, and we were chatting, and he said, of course, you're a big fan of Robert Aickman, and I have to admit that by this time Rosalie and I were both happily publishing as Tartrus Press, and I don't believe we'd actually heard of Robert Aickman before. Tartrus started 24 years ago, and the sort of first, for many years we were associated with the writings of Arthur Machen. Now, Arthur Machen is an absolutely astounding Welsh writer. I'd read many other writers, I enjoyed their work, thought they were marvellous, put books down, moved on to other writers. With Arthur Machen, I wanted to know more. There was something about his writing that made you sort of ask questions. And it wasn't really until Aickman came along that I really found another writer that I started wanting to know more. Although with Machen it's very hard getting hold of the books. What happened in this case was that David Tibet said, oh well, I'll post you and Rosalie some books. And I think just about the next day, a stack of 8 volumes of short stories appeared. They're all first editions. Sub Rosa was signed by Aickman. David was wanting us to read Aickman, and I think we read fairly indiscriminately, sort of dropping into different books and different stories. And one of the first stories that I remember reading was Ravissant, and thinking, what the heck is going on here? Because it's, and I'm sure most of you have read Ravissant, and you read it and you think, this is really quite sexual and sexy, but not in a way that's particularly, it's kind of erotic, but it's not comfortable, it's not nice. And I think, because that would have been in Sub Rosa, and Cold Hand in Mine, I read The Swords, and I thought, whoa, I don't know much about Freud, but swords in a woman like this, what on earth is Aickman going on about? And then the ending, I won't give it away if anyone hasn't read it, it's just surreal. And I think even without having read all 48 stories, Ros and I contacted David Tibet and said, right, we've got to publish this bloke. How do we go about it? And we contacted Leslie Gardner at Artellus. I'm not quite sure what the history had been, but there have been a few problems with the estate, and we were lucky enough to ask for permission just as all the literary estate stuff had been sorted out. I think every year or so, someone had come to the agents and said, we'd like to publish Aickman, and they've been told, there are some difficulties, can you come back later? We were just very, very lucky. And we then spent the next sort of few months of typesetting the books, getting them all together, and arguing about how on earth we were going to publish 48 stories. Should there be 8 separate collections? We ended up with a compromise as far as we're concerned with 2 big fat volumes because they are heavy. I think we argued that they were a kind of reference set because it turned out, as we started talking to people, that a lot of people have got sort of 1 or 2 collections, but not everything. So the collections were, I mean, there's a lot of words.
Yeah, very small print.
And to this day, I still am slightly embarrassed by that book because it is hard to read. I mean, the sentences go on for half a mile before you can go back to the front again. So being able to reprint them recently and actually giving them some proper margins and a decent bit of type and leading has just been great. And somehow we got permission for producing 1,000 copies, and at that time we were publishing sort of 250 or 300 copies of books at most, and most of them were hanging around for a few years. And somehow we were talking to getting permission for and getting the rights for 1,000 copies, and we started to lose our nerve a bit and only asked for 750 of the printers. And the amount of boxes that arrived, it was, I have to admit, we really thought that we had made a mistake. And the orders started coming in, and we thought, this is okay, if we're lucky, we might actually break even here. And then we'd broken even, and we were still getting orders and phone calls from people. And the amount of people who were writing to us and saying, this is marvellous. I never thought I'd get this particular collection or that particular collection. The amount of people who were sort of raiding their building societies, who charged £70 the books. And the amount of interesting people who were turning up and saying, oh yes, I've been a fan of Robert Aickman for years. I had a phone call one evening from a chap called Jeremy who said he'd done stuff on the BBC, and we chatted for about 2 hours with Aickman. He was absolutely over the moon and was saying he wanted my copies for friends of his. And when I came off the phone, I'd forgotten his surname, and Ross said, well, who do you think of called Jeremy who's done stuff at the BBC? So I told people for a good few weeks that Jeremy Hardy was a huge fan of Aickman. And when Jeremy Dyson then said he wanted to buy multiple copies because he was giving copies to Mark Gatiss or people like that, at the same time that through David Tibet, whose Dirtro imprint also appears on the spine, was telling me that he was giving copies or selling copies to some quite famous musicians, quite a few underground figures whose names I'd heard of. I realised that, well, we realised really that Aickman was really, really appreciated by a lot of people in a very quiet way. He hadn't been really discussed. I mean, we were publishing Machen, we were publishing all kinds of other strange and interesting writers, and getting recommendations from people. Every few weeks, someone would write or phone and say, you really need to publish X. In fact, every other recommendation was M.R. James. We've never published M.R. James because I respect that M.R. James was a great teller of ghost stories. He perfected the traditional ghost story. I won't knock him in any way. As far as we're concerned, M.R. James went up a cul-de-sac and built a wonderful mansion at the end of his cul-de-sac, but there's nowhere else to go. Other writers, like Oliver Onions, who we discovered and published, were doing far more interesting things with ghost stories. I think it was Ros went through all the works of L.P. Hardy. There's a lot of collections of short stories there, and found and edited for us a collection of L.P. Hardy's ghost stories. And they're all starting to move into the 20th century, whereas James, I'm not sure the date of his last story, but it sits there, it doesn't move forward. People like Hartley and Onions, Walter de la Mare, who's writing some amazing stories, we're moving into the realms of the psychological, moving into realms where you don't know whether it was a ghost or whether it was the perception of the person who thinks that they've seen a ghost. And then Robert Aickman came along and moved things another step on, which is why we absolutely loved his work. As I say, we were trying to define at the time the idea of a strange story, and we published a collection of what we called strange stories. And we've been publishing various contemporaries, some of whom are here. Quentin S. Crisp is around somewhere, and Mark Samuels, and Nina Allen, and various people. People are still trying to move things on. And various authors are called Aickmanesque these days, or various stories are published, and reviewers use this sort of wonderful shorthand, Aickmanesque, without really necessarily understanding what makes an Aickmanesque story. It's very simple. It's written by Robert Aickman. No one else has been able to do this. The principal reason we published him was that he's a brilliant storyteller. At the time, there was very little discussion on the net. In 1999, there weren't that many chat rooms and forums. But as we started publishing and people started talking, it was very interesting to see the reaction, because while there were people who were wildly enthusiastic, there were the naysayers as well. And in one of these discussion forums that I still frequent, there were quite a few Sherlock Holmes fans, and they hated Aickman. And it took me a little while to realise that what they hated was this idea that the stories aren't all neatly resolved at the end. And plenty of other people have argued as well that, well, plenty of people talk about the fact his stories aren't resolved, you don't know what's happened. They are resolved. His stories are always very, very neatly done. You always know when you come to the end. There's no two ways about it. That's the end of the story. That's all the information that's available to us. And then afterwards you think, why did that happen? Well, how does that relate to other parts of the story? If that was a ghost, if that was an apparition, something from beyond, that means that we can't believe anything that the narrator has said, but some of that is really important to us. It starts becoming, you want to know more, and inevitably you start wanting to know more about the life of the author. To say, there are plenty of books where you finish them, you put them down and say, yeah, that's great, maybe the best book I've ever read. I don't need to know anything about the life. I'm a huge fan of Le Roman by Alain Fournier, and I've got about 5 or 6 books about him, which I've never read. I don't really want to. I'm not that interested. The book is wonderful. Aickman is interesting because he's not that long dead. He died in 81. Most of the people who I know and have talked to never met Robert Aickman. When we asked Ramsey Campbell for an introduction for the collected Strange Stories, he starts off by noting that I think it's Roger Johnson had said on a forum somewhere, or in a magazine, was Aickman really the sort of awkward, unpleasant person that he comes over as? And Ramsey says, no, he was a nice bloke, he was an interesting bloke. I understand why Roger might have thought that, just based on the stories, because it's not just what he's writing about, it's all those little interjections. It's the authorial comments that make him out to be, as he is, a very odd conservative, who has a very jaundiced view of the world, hates the modern world in many respects. But when you start looking into things, looking into his life and what he did, I mean, I had no idea about the Inland Waterways Association to start off with. We read and we published his first volume of autobiography, The Attempted Rescue, which is absolutely wonderful. I'm not sure how much it tells you about his life, because we've just come to realise that there's a certain amount of exaggeration, a certain amount of leaving things out, telling a story because it's a good story. There's a lot there, but he is a very odd man in many respects. So there's now a Journal of Aickman Studies on the net. There are all kinds of essays have been written about him. We all talk about him. And when I first came across Arthur Machen, his daughter Janet was still alive. And Janet had some wonderful stories and was very, very supportive of anyone interested in her father. But we were all able to pontificate and say, oh, of course, Machen thought this and Machen thought that, and you can tell this from such a story. And you know what his beliefs and theories were about this, that, and the other, without anyone gainsaying you. What we've got here with Robert Aickman is a whole load of people who knew him, they were friends. Some of them didn't know him, or didn't know he wrote. Some others didn't know he had anything to do with the Inland Waterways Association. Very few people, Heather's probably the only person I've come across who read him widely and knew him through the Waterways Association. There was a lot to be gained from talking to these people, basically, before they start coming up with their own theories. Because I mean, one of the things that surprises a lot of people was a launch a couple of nights ago at the Freud Museum by Faber of their new paperbacks. And someone actually said, well, of course, Robert Aickman never married. He had affairs with various women. Yes, he married, but poor Ray, his wife, kind of gets written out of the picture by Robert. We don't know why. And perhaps we shouldn't be intruding. They obviously had their relationship. But he refers to sort of going somewhere with someone. He had a party with him, or there were 4 of them in the party, him, Rolt, and 2 others, which would have been Rolt's wife and his wife. And I always assumed that Ray then is this quiet, mousy figure in the background. Tom, around somewhere, told me that he met the 2 of them, and Ray was outgoing. She was the vocal one, she talked, Robert didn't. It's very easy to make assumptions from what we read and what Aickman has given us to read. I'm not saying that he lied at any time, it's just that he gives us a view of the world which isn't quite necessarily what happened, although I think a lot of the time it probably is as he saw it, and the history he gives us is very much what he thought happened, I think, a lot of the time. One of the great things talking to Heather and Graham here is they tell the story of how when the family, they went out with their children with Robert Aickman, and they would visit somewhere, and then sometime later Robert would be relating to somebody else where they'd been and what they'd done. It often bore little relation to what they remembered having happened, and the children, of course, would say, well, that didn't happen. So there is a lot that we can learn about Robert Aickman still. From luckily talking to people who knew him well, and who, I think just about without exception, remember him as being a man who had a great capacity for friendship. Yes, he had some very pronounced views and some slightly eccentric ones at times. But overall, he seems to have been a decent bloke. But more than that, as far as we're concerned, as those who didn't know him, he was a magnificent writer and a very intriguing one. I don't know how long you had.
Would anyone like to ask Ray any questions about Aickman and Tartarus and books?
Is there a record of, I think Ramsay Campbell met Aickman?
Yes, yeah.
All I remember is that Ramsay Campbell commented on the state of Aickman's teeth.
One of the interesting things about Ramsay's recollection, and I really do recommend buying the Faber reprints because they have some wonderful recollections from friends and some illustrations which no one has seen before. Ramsay's recollection is that they had a dinner party and a friend was invited and Robert took against her, and some people asked if she was wearing a wig. Ramsay points out she was not wearing a wig. Leslie Gardner also writes of how there was a dinner party and Robert took against one of the guests there as well. He obviously could be prickly and awkward. He does appear to be quite fascinating in that he would stand up in front of hundreds of people and address them about the inland waterways, and obviously do so very professionally. One-to-one, he was obviously absolutely charming. People who met on a one-to-one basis had nothing but praise for the fact that he would make them feel interesting and get them to talk about subjects, well, he would talk about subjects that they knew nothing about, but they would feel as though they were just as erudite as him. There are obviously certain sort of combinations of people where he must have had a certain amount of nerves, or sort of a certain amount of, I think it has been suggested he has a slight low self-esteem problem,
So fragile self-esteem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he does appear to have been wanting to be sort of slightly in control of things.
Could I make a suggestion about one of the reasons that we came to the conclusion that he did sometimes was very, very rude to people? Robert had a very uncanny ability of sizing people up I think it's something said, Robert must have decided, this chap will never understand me, I'm going to give him up. He didn't suffer fools gladly. If he thought a person was a fool, that was it.
Which meant that with the Inland Waterways Association, he had a vision of how to save the waterways.
Yeah.
If anyone came along who didn't agree with his vision, which luckily it turns out was the right vision, he realised that it wasn't worth wasting his time on, presumably. And unfortunately, he set up the association with LTC Rod, who wrote some very good but old-fashioned ghost stories. And Rod had a different idea. He felt that you could save certain canals, or all of them. Aickman felt that you should fight for them all. There was no point in only having bits of canals, and presumably they needed to be joined up. You couldn't get anywhere otherwise. Inevitably, they fell out because Rod didn't share the same vision.
Robert Aickman was also involved in the setting up of the Delius Society and was co-opted to help them design their constitution. And he felt it was extremely important to have provisions for expelling members of the constitution. The rest of them didn't want this sort of stuff. And in the end they didn't listen to it, and they said in his obituary, and we have never wanted to expel a member.
I can have a funny personal story about that. When we set up the Yorkshire Derwent Trust, Robert also insisted that there was this provision for expelling people. And then, on a dreadful occasion, when a number of the members of the Yorkshire Derwent Trust and the IWA got suborned, I myself was threatened under the same constitution for being expelled.
Wish it had happened.
Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I mean, I'm afraid, I'm ashamed to say, I hadn't heard of Robert Aickman until about 2 weeks ago. And I've read one of the stories, The Swords, this morning, which I thought was really brilliant. And you're right, it obviously just, it's perfect, it ends and you know. But I just wondered why someone in your shoes, who's in the publishing world, why you hadn't heard of him sooner, do you think?
Partly because, I think for various, I won't say legal reasons, but the estate wasn't sorted out for quite some time. And there were a lot of people who knew him, liked him, and they were quite an interesting group of people, but 99% of people interested in ghost stories I don't think had heard of him, or knew the name, but had never had a chance to read him.
Well, surely I was speaking there, the favourite books of ghost stories which Aickman edited were, the 1960s, they're the ones that got big interested.
Yeah, I mean, the Fontana.
I think a lot of it goes back to the Sherlock Holmes factor. That you read something, the Swords, yes, comes to a conclusion, there's something, you read some of the others and think, my God, what is this? And they're constructed on a very, very different level. They're constructed in a very, very different way from the kind of thing which appeals to ghost story anthology editors. And I think that has precluded its wider popularity for a long time.
He himself was very keen on the Sherlock Holmes.
I was going to ask one question, May I? The reprints that you put out are absolutely lovely books, and thank you for. I was just going to ask, is there any possibility of a novel, The Late Breakfast, as here, or a complication?
Faber have now brought it down as a Faber find.
Thank you.
I wonder, Craig, could you say something about the River Runs Uphill? Because it's
we are about to reprint The River Runs Uphill, which is his second volume of autobiography, which I remember Ros finding a copy at a book fair, one of those book fairs you go to where it's all very expensive Arthur Rackham books and books on transport. Anyway, there was a copy of The River Runs Uphill, which we bought, and I remember I don't even know if I finished it the first time round, because there is a lot in it which is the minutiae of the Inland Waterways and committee meetings and meeting various people that he felt that could help with the association. And I kind of discarded it because it wasn't literary. Then, fairly recently, we looked at it again and realised that sort of dotted throughout the whole book are all these sort of asides and comments which are just pure Aickman. It is odd. I mean, he writes his autobiographies like his fiction. He raises more questions than he answers most of the time. Luckily, through Petzal and Graham and the archive, we've managed to find some early drafts where not only do we have a whole new chapter which deals with literary matters, which we can understand why it was excised, because the book was published by Pearson in the 1980s for pretty much the Waterways market. But there are odd whole paragraphs and sentences, quite often about literary matters, that sort of bring the whole thing much more to life. I think he was being careful in some of his excisions, and needlessly so. But it is, again, a fascinating book. It only goes to the first few years of the Waterways Association. There should have been another volume. He was obviously planning another volume. It was never written because, frankly, during his lifetime, he couldn't find a publisher for this main volume.
The Pearson copy of the River Runs Uphill says that it's the only book that the committee of the Inland Waterways Association said they wanted to read through before they were sorry, we need to finish now and move on to tea and cake, but we'll have lots of time to talk afterwards where we'll move into free-form panel discussion for an hour.
Yeah, but it's in the coat room.